Eye blinks are usually used just to keep the character alive. So you'll see a character walk into a stand position and not do much, but they'll blink like 1, 2, 3, 4, until the scene's finished. And this is the standard simple eye blink pattern. And if you're setting up a puppet or a rig, these are the basic poses you want. And the first one was the eyes open. Then the next is 1/3 closed, then 1/3 open, and then open. Now, these are usually given in animation books, but they're assuming that you're animating on twos, meaning each frame is held for 2 frames. So this would be frame 1, 3, frame 5, and usually hold the eye closed position for at least 2 frames, and then another in between that and this, and then between that and this. So you're looking at 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, about 10 frames to get from here to here, if that makes sense. So if you're animating traditionally, it's basically these 5 drawings held on twos. So let's see what that looks like when animated. That's it. Pretty simple. And you'll see that on pretty much any given TV show. And it doesn't come more basic than that. But it's quite respectable and it works. So now we'll take it up a notch and move the eyebrows with the eye. Now, if you did this every time the character blinks, it might start looking a bit squinty, but it's certainly nice to have it for, stronger blinks. And it doesn't mean you have to go all the way, down with the eyebrows. You could vary it a little bit and maybe just take them down that far. So maybe you have the eyebrows here on the closed image. But it certainly doesn't mean your eyebrows are locked in when you do blink. So you have a continuum of possible motions from the eyebrows don't move to the eyebrows move like this. And let's see what this looks like. That's pretty good. And you notice as well, I've used the blink to cover the change of direction of the pupils. So he starts looking to the left and he blinks, and then by the time his eyes open, he's heard something off to the right. So again, that also emphasizes the fact that these kinds of eyebrow motions are good for changes of expression. I could have changed the expressions of the eyebrows themselves to make them look frightened or happy or whatever. So that's the kind of intermediate eye blink. Let's look at the strongest one. So this would be a really snazzy eye blink. And the thing to watch out for is how it's really dialing up the complexity of just exactly what are we looking at here with all these creases. And again, a very, very talented animator that I used to work with was a master of these kinds of shapes. And I would do the follow-up or the in-betweens on his scenes. And many times I would wonder, what am I looking at here? Like, which one of these shapes is moving into which one of these other shapes? Because he would have so many little, details in there. But this is basically pretty simple. This line here becomes this line. And that is also this line here. So this triangular wedge is going to in-between into the full lower eyelid. And pretty much the same on the way out. And this crease here is the upper eyelid. It's going to get totally squashed by the brow as it moves down, so no need to worry about that after this frame. So that's pretty much it. Let's take a look at this in animation. So that's pretty nice. It's a good, strong, interesting squint. And I've also held the closed shape for, I think, 2 frames. So it reads more. If I had held it for 1, there'd be a danger that the closed eye wouldn't read very well. You could even hold it for 3 or 4 if you think it's still not doing enough work. So that is the really strong blink of astonishment. So he has seen something horrible or amazing happening, and this is the kind of blink you want, and not the eyebrow not moving in form. That would just look maybe like underwhelming, whereas this is a really, really strong reaction. So again, you have a spectrum of eye blinks, from the stiff to the extremely dramatic. In a previous movie, I showed you this animated head, showing what the eyes look like when you pivot and rotate the head around. So we're seeing them from, up from below and so forth. There is another element that you really want to focus on to make these really believable, and that's the pupil. Now, it wasn't an issue when we were looking at it with this design because the pupils are just little dots in this one, so they're really not a technical concern. But let's see what happens if we, start to make them look more naturalistic. So I've zoomed in on it so we have a better look. So what I've done is I've simply mapped in into the pupil symbol the wider area around it. If it's an iris or a retina, don't ask me, I'm not a doctor. So as you can see, it's starting to look a little flat. If we look at these, they're just looking fake. And especially there. So there's a few tricks that we can do to really on-fake that, just to cheat dimension. So the thing to remember about the pupil is that it's sitting on a spherical surface. So we want to avoid this kind of shape. And this is what beginners often fall into. And it's very easy to fall into this trap as well when you're building eyes out of symbols, when you're using like a circular wedge and then just sliding it over an eye mask. You'll get this happen a lot. So what you need to do is a trick that we used to do back when we drew by hand, which is to draw the pupil in this pattern here so that the line is almost the same as the external shape. So we're drawing a series of concentric ellipses that follow those red arrows right into here. So if I was to draw the perimeter of the pupil, it would follow this curve here. It would not do this. That's what we're seeing here. This looks flat. This does not. Even though this is unrealistic to some degree, this is a cartoon exaggeration, but it was invented for a reason. It just looks better. So let's see if we can apply that. So here you can see the animation of the eye with the correct elliptical pattern applied to it, as best as I could do given the constraints of the animation software that I was using to create this. So as you can see, if I stop on any of these, I've moved the center of the eye in closer, and you can see how it's fully touching to the point of the upper eyelid, both on the inside and the outside of the eye. The same here. This could be softened a bit. I would ideally like to move it down a little bit, but it's still not too bad. And notice here again, the ellipse of the eye is following or mating with the outer ellipse of the eyelid itself. Same here. If you followed the edge, it wouldn't be floating in behind the eyeball like that. So that's what's creating strong designs and creating the illusion of greater dimensionality. And on the left side, you can see the bad version. On the right side, the good version. So as you can see, the difference is fairly huge. If I stop any of these, you can see flat, round, flat, round, flat, round. Also stronger designs. That's a stronger, appealing design. This looks flat. It's like pancaked. And we can look at any of these and all the way through. Flat, flat, round, round. So remember this technique of nesting or controlling separately, if you can, the center of the eye, the outer colored area, the whites of the eye, and this ellipse, touching an ellipse is really good to use. There will be times where you have to move it in maybe further than this. That's fine. But as long as you're as close to this method as possible and avoid this kind of flatness, you'll be on really, really good ground. And you'll find that your characters have much stronger intensity because their eyes will just look that more focused and more alive. In the previous movies, we've been looking at eyes in the cartoon style. So now let's look at the human eye in, a more realistic manner. And this is definitely a realistic style, but not to the point where it's hyper-realistic. I mean, we can still push this further than a human eye could, but a human eye is still very expressive. So there's that danger when you deal with a more realistic style that you become inhibited, a little bit scared of pushing the forms. You really can push them further than you think a lot of the time and get away with murder. So let's take these 7 shapes. And again, these come from a previous course that I did on how to draw cartoon characters for animation. So if you do want to see that in more detail, you can follow that course. But let me show you what this guy looks like when he's finally animated. So first we cycle through all of the 7 poses. And on another pass, we just hold them. So we hold the final 7. So we go from one to the other. And now we just move smoothly, so you can see a much more, rapid fire motion. And then again. So as you can see, nothing is jumping out as super unrealistic. Yeah, it's a pretty aggressive range of motion for a human eye. But at no point in this series am I like reacting for the shock button or anything. He looks human. The corner is fixed. I've locked down the corner of the eye. It's doing a little bit of movement, but nothing that's going to worry anybody. The other side is the corner of the eye is more or less sitting around the equator, where it should be. We have big ranges of motion on the eyebrows, which is completely realistic. I'm doing it now just to prove to myself that my eyebrow can move quite a lot. And as the eye opens, you see an increase in the strength of the various wrinkles and crease lines. So this should give you a good feel for what you can get away with, and you could probably even push the formers even further than that. One of the most fun tricks that I picked up along the way was the idea of thinking of the entire eye area as being a continuous Zorro mask, and or one of those Venetian eye masks. And as you distort the eyebrows and the various eyes up and down, try to sketch in or visualize or even lightly draw in this imaginary shape, because it'll help you when it comes to thinking about the entire area as one connected region, and how this imaginary line here may have wrinkles that follow it or other factors that change the design. And it helps consistency and just unifies the whole shape together. Not that you draw this in the final version, mind you. That would be strange. But if we toggle between one and the other, you'll see we're getting some really nice, that's a really nice strong transition. Looking at it now, maybe the corners are coming in. I always nitpick, you may have noticed that. This corner of the eye, maybe it's moving in just a little too much. And when I say too much, I mean by that amount. And this one here, that corner, maybe it's moving in just a little bit too much, but again, by almost a pencil width. So do feel free to be picky, but don't be so picky that you become paralyzed, because that's a trap too. And I think we talked about a similar principle in a previous movie, but it's good to see this from as many angles as possible. When we construct the eye, it's very common to construct the eye around a horizontal eye line, like an equator around the skull. But you can also construct it around an angle, so you get a more interesting eye look. And this is good for any number of things. So don't ever feel limited to this, which can seem very prosaic after a while. So I've just done some different designs showing the different possibilities of this curvature. And even from up angles, you can see it can be quite tricky to try to pinpoint this line, because it's no longer sitting along this easy to plot equator. So it's definitely trickier to draw, but it is more interesting. So here we have our 3 from profile view, and we can just compare the two extremes. So you can see the difference. And here we have, I'll take the top one and the bottom one, and we'll compare them directly. So you can see the kind of changes that we're getting. And here we're, again, a similar effect. So I think the one where we've lifted the corner of the eye off of the equator line is more interesting to look at. You don't have to go that high. You can make it a fraction of this. But it's a good thing to do if you have the subtlety to be able to get away with it. It's easy to overlook something as fundamental as the center of mass, where the weight is. And in the two objects to the left, it's fairly simple. The ball center of mass is in the middle. The wood, unless it's strange wood, has the center of mass in the middle. Hammer, no, the hammer center of mass will be, depending on how heavy this end is, it'll be somewhere around here. Could be there, could be here. But if you put your center of mass roughly in this area, you won't be far wrong. So here we've marked them out, something like that. So if we throw the ball across the screen, nice arc path, a little bit of a slow in at the top and slow out, nothing wrong with that, perfectly normal. And there you can see there's our arc path marked out in red dots with the cross representing the center of mass. Notice that the wood spins around its center of mass. Now that we have something that's longitudinal, it's longer than it is wide, we can actually see this. We couldn't see it in the ball, but we can certainly see it in the wooden plank. Gives it a nice feeling of real physics as well. It's a simple action, but it's very effective. Now, when the hammer spins across, remember that the center of mass is slightly out of whack. So we get a very interesting and quite different series of actions as it tumbles around that center. So this is going to be an issue if you have a character with a high or a low center of mass. So if you have a fat character, he might have a center of mass really low, much lower than his halfway point. If you have one of the big, strong, muscular characters, his center of mass could be really high. So it's one of the things to watch out for when not just animating objects, but also when animating people. And if we overlap all of the frames of the hammer spinning action, you can see what I mean, how we get this really lovely like cartwheel of the wooden handle as it cycles through. And you can see this point here where it almost stops moving, which would be bad relative to the motion. If that happened, you might get a point where they jam together, in which case you would try to avoid that by increasing the spin of the hammer. Do whatever it takes so you don't get something apparently sticking in midair. But in this case, it doesn't happen. We have enough room between it that we get a really lovely freewheeling spin around the center of mass of the hammer. So again, one of the things that's easy to forget, but do remember it. One of the things that either you love or hate is the need to do a crowd scene from time to time. And in the traditional era, crowd scenes were actually kind of boring but easy to do because people weren't too picky about them. So there are different ways that we can treat them in computer animation by nesting the animation inside a symbol or a component. Or if you work in Flash or Harmony, you can do that. And then CGI, some programs will do that too. So if you want to make a crowd scene, you only have to animate one character and then duplicate that symbol to make 4 or 5 or 700 extras that are just the same. The trick is to make variations in these symbols, or at least as best you can, so that you don't get it all homogeneous. So let's see how we do this with a very simple crowd scene. So this action here is extremely basic, and I deliberately hacked this out. It was for a project where we had like hundreds of people, and you were never going to see them this close. So I wasn't worried about the design of the feet or that hand design. It worked really well. We have frame 1 and frame 16 are the same. That's our cycle. And we have an anticipation and an overshoot, and that's it. Here's the first pass, and look at that awful skewing on the feet. Terrible. So as I said, this was deliberate hack work. I wanted to see if I could make it work with doing as little as I could. And I was going to have to do 20 of these different crowd people. It wasn't going to be necessary to make it look too sweet. So that's the first pass, one character. The next pass was to duplicate the crowd. So now we have 7 angry men. And as you can see, they're all moving at the same time. And even the best riot mob isn't that disciplined. Let's see if we can begin to break them up. So I made some small adjustments on this one where I made a couple of them a little smaller, especially the guys in the back. Not by much, just enough to make them look a little less fake. And then I darkened the characters further in the back. Now, the big problem that we're still facing is everyone's moving at the same time. And this is where we can really break it up. So the magic comes in when you overlap the timing. So remember, I had the character animated inside a symbol. So I took each symbol and just changed the timing. So this one begins on frame 1, this on frame 3, this on frame 9, this on frame 5, so that they're all offset from one another. And the end result is that we're starting to see a crowd that looks really natural. Even as cheaply animated as this, it's a really, really nice rent-a-mob. And you can get something like this off the ground in not much time if you're working in some software like Flash or Harmony. With the CGI system, depending on the model, might not take too long. And if it's a crowd scene that are going to be small in the background, you don't have to invest a huge amount of time in lots of little details. So let me show you the final scene as it appeared. So as you can see, now this is about the distance that if you're going to be going to all the trouble of making protesters, this is starting to look kind of believable. And there's all kinds of little mistakes. If you look close, there's people floating in the air. These were actually going to be behind, and they were behind like a foreground level. There's a big hill here, and they were all slightly behind it. So I wasn't too worried about placing feet and things like that. I could certainly go back in and fix all that, but it looks pretty nice. So that is the process of taking a very simple animation, and it depends on how many of those little symbols you want to make. In this case, I think I made about 10 or 12 little tiny people, so they were all different colors and genders and all kinds of shapes. So the real secret to this kind of magic is overlapping the timing. And once you can deploy that, all kinds of wonderful things will open up to you, including having a good protest. Athletes hire psychologists to help them tackle the mental aspect of their game. So if a mental quirk can destroy a sports star, or indeed make them capable of winning again, why don't artists take that aspect of their lives just as seriously? So if anything, the psychological field for writers, musicians, painters is absolutely critical to their success. Now, I've seen really, really good artists and designers totally crippled by something as ethereal as an insecurity complex. And in really bad cases, they can be unable to work on their own projects. Maybe the same person, if they go to work in a studio where the work is within a team project, they're fearless and they'll go in, they'll happily do their work. But when they go home at night and they're looking at their own personal project, suddenly they freeze up or they leave the work half finished or never begun at all. Because the problem is, the second they release that work, they themselves are to be judged. It's their project going onto YouTube or being published, and suddenly the fear strikes. And I've had this happen to me in studio settings and with my personal work. So it's like a mental demon and something that we have to conquer. So as I said, this fear is perfectly normal. We all have it to some degree. And the danger is when it grows and then this thing in your head gets out of control. Now, an entire studio can have its own atmosphere or its own culture. And what I found in my experience is that this kind of thing, more often than not, flows down from the top. So if you've got a bullying, sarcastic director, somebody who's constantly putting you down, using snide remarks, not giving you constructive criticism, but just sniping. Maybe the owner of the studio himself is extremely underqualified and acts out their own insecurity and fear by passing it on to everybody else. These workplaces can become really unpleasant places to be. And the opposite is true. I've worked in studios where the bosses were absolutely expert. And not only that, but they were really nice people. I've also worked in studios that were anarchic. And they can be fun, but they can be anarchic as well. So you've got this spectrum of workplaces. They're not all the same. And if anyone tells you all studios are pretty much the same, that just isn't true. So don't confuse this concept of an unpleasant or a bullying atmosphere with stress. It doesn't matter where you go. You're going to have deadlines. You're going to have stress. The question is, how bad is the stress? How poorly organized is the place or well organized is the place? And do people basically pass on their own grief onto other people, and hopefully by not too much? But even when I work on my own personal projects, I end up looking like this by the end of any of them. Now, there's no guarantee that a small studio will be a happy studio and a big studio will be an unhappy one. It can be, oftentimes it's the other way around. I've worked for big studios that had very happy small units working within them. And I've worked for small studios that were hell on earth. And I've also worked on small studios that were amazingly good places to be. So the bottom line is, if you find yourself in a situation where the culture of the workplace is basically abusive or bullying, you really have to seriously think about whether or not you want to stay there for very long. And if you do stay in such a place, then you also have to be careful to protect yourself from it mentally. You also have to be careful that you don't internalize that behavior and start acting it out yourself. And then you become part of the problem rather than part of the solution. Now, I do not think it's a coincidence that when my work really began to come together to the point where I was drawing more confidently, where my production was going up, it was because I was working in a small, happy, well-run studio where the dominant culture was we're going to work hard, but we're not going to be nasty to one another. And that was a studio with maybe 40 to 100 people. And we worked very hard. We were working like long hours. We were well treated. The pay was good. Everything was working great. And that's the ideal. Those places still exist. They are out there to some degree. So if you find yourself working in such a place, definitely make the most of it. And that's your window of opportunity to really take your work and absolutely take it up by several notches. In a previous movie, I spoke about fear and the problems of dealing with fear. And one of the things that can result from this kind of toxic atmosphere is that you can end up with a creative block. And I had a really horrendous one at one point early on in my career in animation. And to give you an idea about how bad it was, I would put a drawing on the drawing board and I would begin to draw. And I would draw about this much. My body would physically lock up and it was like a fist was clenching inside my stomach because I just knew that no matter what I did following this, it wasn't going to be good enough. And it was the most horrible feeling. So I know what a writer feels like when they say they have a mental block or a writer's block. You're just caught up in this thing in your head, a loop that doesn't have a beginning or an end that says you're not good enough, you're not good enough, you're not good enough. So I was within maybe 2 or 3 weeks of just walking out of the studio, so I never had to deal with this again. But I didn't. And the reason why was just a piece of really good luck. A friend of mine in the department lent me this book. And Seamus Culhane was a Disney animator who worked on Snow White and the Seven Dwarfs. And as chance had it, the same thing had happened to him. And he was really, really close to his career ending. And then he discovered a technique that involved bypassing the mental block completely. So Culhane's solution was to draw fast. He said, put a clean sheet of paper on the drawing board and just draw quickly. So to demonstrate what this looks like, it's really a very, very quickly gesture drawing. So now this is a really bad drawing. So he said, don't worry about that. Simply throw it over your shoulder. Don't erase it. Keep going. Don't draw frame numbers. Don't worry about sequence and scene numbers. Don't worry about timing charts. Forget all of it. Just throw that thing on the floor and keep going. So he said his advice was to pick an emotional state, and in my case, it was anger, frustration. And he said, just do a series of very fast drawings of a character who's angry. So I would do one of these every 30 seconds or every minute, no more than that, where you've got your character running around, ranting, and just draw very quickly. So these are gesture drawings of the state, whatever emotional state you want. So I'll just throw that on the floor because I still don't like any of these. Anger, rage, frustration. So you're pounding the table in wrath. So I spent about an hour doing this. And I found as I was doing it, I had been given permission by Culhane to do really bad drawings. And when you know that this guy had worked on Snow White and had this amazing improvement in his work, then it kind of loosens you up a bit and you're not so worried anymore. So I did this. I just did drawing after drawing after drawing of this little character standing at a table. And actually I had them drawing. They were animating and, getting increasingly irritated with their work as I had been for the previous 6 months. Like that. That's not too bad. Another drawing. So each one of these would be another sheet of paper. I was doing this in 1991 or thereabouts. And I had drawings where they're like pulling their hair. Now watch what I'm doing. I'm barely taking the pen off the page. So these are bits of steam coming off them. Drawing them pretty much consistently the same size. So they're not like filling the page. They're just, doing all this. So I think, let's crumple up a sheet of paper. I'll bring in the shoulder up like that. It really sells the idea. So it was going on I spent this, like I said, for about an hour, after which I had a pile of about 60 to 100 sheets of paper on the ground. And I would go back through them and go, some of these I like, some I don't. I like that one. That was a really good one. So we pull it off to one side. We have another one. That's not too bad. So I arranged all these afterwards and I put them into a sequence and I shot them on the animation stand. And by the time I was finished, I had a 40-second long scene. The next night I came in and I in-betweened it. And basically a very simple, very rough pose test. And that was the animation test that got me into the animation department at the Don Bluth studio. So Culhane's technique does work. And he said in his book that he was very surprised to find that so few people had ever really taken him up on the method. But it's a fantastic way to break a logjam. And just as Culhane was giving me permission to loosen up and stop taking myself so seriously, I'm passing that on to you in case you find yourself in this position. Now, I know some of you are working on computer animation or rig systems that might not allow for such a process. If that is the case, my advice to you is get a physical notebook with paper and pencil and do the same process that I did. Draw physically. No matter how crude your drawing style is, you'll find as you doodle and sketch, it will loosen you up, it will relax you, and you'll be able to replicate as much of this process as possible. So this is like a more obviously finished version of the states of drawing. And my problem with my mental block was I was seeing this in my head. I was seeing the finished item. But you have grades of looseness. And as you can see here on the left, the Seamus Culhane recommended loose gesture drawing. And you can tie this down to a little, more solid form if you feel like it. But if you're roughing out a scene or thumbnailing it, you really don't want to be drawing at this level of detail. This level of detail here is as much as you need for a thumbnail or for a first pass. And so just to show you through the sequence of steps as to how you approach one of these very quick gesture drawings, you think of the pose from top to bottom, from the top of the head to the bottom of the feet, and the spine or the line of action. And then you begin to very, very quickly rough in the various body masses. And this is sufficiently adequate to show you the staging, the general attitude of your key pose. So these are the 4 states. And so this is something like this is about the state that you want to achieve for these very quick gesture drawings. And then these would be the general outline or levels of detail that you process through before you get to this. So again, the principles you're looking to follow are line of action, the very basic construction with the volumes and the masses. It doesn't have to be 100%, just, ballpark. Shoot for a nice silhouette. Other than that, don't worry about it. So this is to show you some examples of other very quick gesture drawings that I've done based on different emotions. So here we have a guy laughing, very simple pose, confident walk, a big ta-da pose. So once you work at this level, I think you'll find it much easier to get into a flow and to do a lot of poses. And as you can see, even though I didn't draw these to be animated, they work into one another very nicely. So we have 4 poses that are angry, frustrated, or hostile. And we have a very beautiful sequence of reference artwork that we can then use for our scenes or for reference for any future project where we have to create this kind of work. So I hope this is useful for you. I know everyone's different. We all have different tricks for getting past these kind of nasty mental states we work ourselves into. This one worked for me. And if you are unlucky enough to end up in that state, I hope it works for you too. In this movie, I want to talk to you about improvement and whether we improve in a linear way or a different way, or whether indeed we improve at all, because some of us hit a plateau and get stuck there. So before I became an animator, I worked as an assistant animator doing in-betweens. And the assistant job was very, very monotonous and very dull. But I was always working towards being an animator where I could really begin to grow and improve. And one of the animators in the department told me that when you get into the animation department, you are not going to improve in a linear way. And I thought surely you would, that it would be incremental, that as the different bits of tricks and techniques began to add up, you would slowly go from a 2-foot-a-week animator to a 3-foot-a-week animator to a 4-foot-a-week animator. And a foot is 16 frames. So, maybe 3 feet is about 2 seconds or, thereabouts. And he said, no, that's not what happens. What happens is something that you would never really think. He said that you will spend 3 months, 4 months as a 2-foot-a-week animator. And during this period, you will be sweating because you'll think, there's no way these people are going to keep paying me to do 1 second or 1.5 seconds of animation every week. And he said, one weekend, you'll go home. You'll go home on a Friday and you'll come in on Monday and you'll do 5 feet a week. And he said there'll be no linear improvement, that it'll be almost, for all intents and purposes, it'll feel like overnight. And I said, that is the stupidest thing I've ever heard in my life. And it can't possibly be true. And a few months later, I finally got into the animation department. And that's exactly what happened to me. I spent, I think, about 5 months or 6 months on this terrifying 2-foot-a-week plateau. And I was in despair. I was awaiting the tap on the shoulder and the call to the office. And then one Monday I came in and I did 5 feet a week, 5 feet a week, 5 feet a week for the next 6 months or 7 months. So that seems to be the way it works, at least for some of us. And if this is the case, it can be deeply frustrating because when you're stuck on these flats, these plateaus, you can feel like you're going nowhere. So the emotional state is like this guy pushing against the wall, trying to climb up or teleport rather to the next plateau before he, can basically lose his job. And then hopefully there's another plateau on top of that. So how do you break through these walls? How do you teleport onto the next plateau? Or even can you? Because let's face it, at some point there's a limit to how far you can go. So the trick is to find the highest peak that you can reach. Never stop trying, but at some point you've got to be realistic about it. But how do you do that? How do you make these jumps? So my theory is that you can't do it by lots of little things. I think you have to take on a big project. It's not enough to do a little drawing here or a little drawing there. But if you say to yourself, I'm going to do 60 drawings or a larger number of drawings over the course of 4 weeks or 6 weeks or 4 months or 6 months, that is something that gives you the best chance of making that breakthrough. And one way of finding out is when you finish that cycle to look back at what you did when you began. And if you find yourself going, oh, that looks really, really bad, congratulations, you've done it. So you choose a challenging project or a cycle or something bigger than a weekend project. A weekend project is not enough. The goal must be realistic. It's not enough to take on your own feature film, or it's too much. You'll never reach that goal. You're going to fail. The project should be something that you can realistically hope to complete. It should take time. As I said, it can't be a weekend project or even a week-long project. This should be something that you measure preferably in months. You have to apply yourself fairly consistently. If you put this thing down, walk away for 4 months and then come back, I'm not sure that might work. In some cases it could, but I think you need to apply consistent effort on this project over many, many days and weeks. And it's really important, not so much to make the breakthrough, but to finish it simply as a good mental practice so that when you take on these projects, you don't bail on them. Too many people have really, really brilliant projects sitting half finished on a shelf somewhere. It's not good for your morale. So when I talk about the kind of projects you should take on, this is the kind of state that you want. You want something that's within reach, but it involves you breaking a sweat. If the project doesn't involve you challenging yourself, really pushing those muscles in your head, then I'm not so sure you're going to make these breakthroughs. Having said that, you don't, as I said earlier, take on a project that you can't succeed. So if I wanted to be a bodybuilder, I wouldn't walk into the gym and start picking up the 200-pound weights. I would start out like the guy on the right, and I would work my way up through grades. It would be difficult enough for me, I'm skinny and feeble, it would be difficult enough for me to lift the weight on the left side 100 times. So I wouldn't want to incur physical injury. But once I've done the right-sided light weight, I work my way up until I, can do 1 of these, then 2 of these, then 3 of these. I actually worked with a guy who was like this, and it was really depressing. He said, I'm going to make my own feature film. And my response was, no, you're not. Because you haven't even made a 1-minute short. You haven't made a 2-minute short. You haven't made a 5-minute short. You haven't made a 30-minute short. I have. I know how much work they are. And they're grades. These are the plateaus that I was speaking about earlier. You train yourself like a mountain climber. You pick a lower peak, then a higher peak, then a higher peak. You don't start climbing Mount Everest. But you have to pick peaks that are real challenges. It's not enough to pick a gentle hill. The same principle goes if you're drawing comic books and you've never drawn a 60-page comic. You don't start with a 60-page comic. Trust me, an 8-page comic is more than enough to get on with. Pick something that is a lot of work. It's going to take you maybe 6 weeks. When you've done that, then you'll think, okay, now I think I'm ready for the 20 or the 60 when I finish the 20. The same goes for animation. You have your 1-minute plateau, your 3-minute plateau, your 7, and your 25. So these are walls that you have to train for. So again, this is get your first work down. When you've done that and prove to yourself that you can do the quality and the quantity, then you're ready to move on. And in the previous graphics, I gave the impression that it was a stair step and fairly consistent, but it's not, of course. Again, we're all different and we all have these different plateaus. You start at the left and you're shooting for somewhere on the right. And the great puzzle is that you don't even know if you can get to these. You can bash your head off this wall for a very long time and never get to any of these plateaus. And I've had a couple of these jumps, and believe me, when you do them, it feels great. If you've played those computer games where you play a character like walking around World of Warcraft or one of these MMORPGs and they level up, suddenly you go boink, you level up and you have all these points that you can reassign. It's like that, but this is better because it's real life. And suddenly you're doing a drawing that's better than the drawing that you did before that you couldn't have done a week ago, or your quality can increase. Then you have the quantity increase. You're doing a greater volume of work than you ever thought you could do before. But you have to sweat. You really have to work and sweat at these almost soul-destroying walls. And this is how I think about it in my head and why I keep at it. Because once you've had one or two of these breakthroughs, it really gives you confidence that you should keep pushing and hope for that leap of faith that you are going to make the advancement to the next stage. But there is no guarantee. At some point, we level out. At some point, you'll reach a point where maybe there isn't another one. Or is there? One of the big risks that you will face when you work in animation is like Sisyphus in the ancient Greek mythology. You're doomed to push a gigantic ball up a hill forever. And that ain't any fun. But at least unlike Sisyphus, when we get the ball to the top of the hill, usually you have a finished cartoon to show for it. So it's not that bad. But one of the big risks of the job is we end up doing the same thing over and over and over again because it's extremely repetitious. So you have to watch out for this. And the big danger that you face is burnout. And I've burnt out at least twice. And what you find is that it really is semi-permanent. There is some recovery from it. But once you've burnt out once, it's easier to burn out a second time. And the danger is you can end up unable to work at a certain degree or level that you were able to work at before. And so, for example, if I were to do like a production project that involved working 60 to 80 hours a week for 6 months, I wouldn't be able to do it because that part of my brain got fried when I was in my 20s. And I moved to a different field of animation that doesn't require so much work. And then I burnt out there as well because I didn't learn my lesson. So what this feels like, let me show you an animation. Imagine you have two batteries for your laptop, and the one on the left is a healthy battery and the one on the right has been damaged. So what you can do is you can build up a battery so that it has a charge, and then you have a full charge, and then you have so much time with which you can work. The problem is that the battery on the right's been damaged, so the amount of energy that you can get between charges is much lower. You can still do pretty much what you could do before, but for a shorter period of time before you hit that wall again. So a person who hasn't burnt out can build like a huge charge and work for 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10 months. I'm the guy on the right, so I can work along with them for a few months and then I'm down to zero. So they can take a 2-week holiday, every 6 months and come back and they're good to go again. I can't do that. So this raises the problem, how do you prevent this from happening to you? And I don't really have a magic solution for that, but just a basic advice to watch your own work cycles to make sure that if you haven't burnt out that you don't. Prevention is better than cure. In this case, the prevention is making sure that you don't fall into a trap where you work for 8 months, 9 months, 10 months without a holiday. You must take regular breaks. America in particular has a ferocious work ethic. It doesn't do you any good whatsoever if you end up through that work ethic like the figure on the right here. You may have figured by now that I'm very fond of, cartoons of octopus-like creatures, but having this thing on your back is no fun because then you have to organize your entire career around the fact that you're somewhat limited in the amount of energy that you can expend on a given project. So what I do now when I'm working is I'm very conscious of my body and my mind, and when I feel the exhaustion creeping up, and it hit me like a sledgehammer a few months ago, and I was in the middle of a drawing, and even though I love the work, and this is the problem too, you see, you can be working on something that you really, really love and that you can't wait to finish, and there's nothing about the project that you hate. But if you've been working on it for 6 months, 7 months, and it's very easy to do when you enjoy the work, your brain will still go, that's it, I'm done with this. And I was literally halfway through a drawing and I realized that I was drawing at maybe 20% to 30% of my actual ability. And I thought, that's it. And I'm lucky in that I didn't need to stay on the production schedule. So I was able to take basically a 6-week break, during which I did some work. I didn't just lie on the sofa eating chocolates, but I did take a major break and I took my workflow down to about 3 hours a day from 12 or 13 until I recovered again like the damaged laptop battery that I am. So the other thing to watch out for is your body. A girl I worked with many years ago called this animator physique, because mind, body, it's good to think of them as one, I think. We do have the problem of we're sitting down in a crouch position, and this is what I look like when I'm creating these courses, and it really isn't very healthy. So this is why I always get out of my house frequently. Every day at a given time in the afternoon, I'm gone to the coffee shop for 2 or 3 hours so that at least I get a bit of walking and sunshine. So, be sure that you respect the fact that you do the same, especially those of you listening who are younger. You are not immortal. Now, there's a well-known passage in the Richard Williams animation book where he talks about headphones. He advises against using headphones. My attitude's a little more subtle than that. I think there are times when you can't use headphones if you're working on something that really requires concentration. However, a great deal of the work that we do in animation is really repetitious and does not involve higher brain function. If I'm lining some artwork, if I'm cleaning up a drawing, I don't need to be completely conscious of the work I'm doing there. I think as many of you probably do already, listen to podcasts or audiobooks, music. There is no problem in listening to audiobooks or podcasts or music. Like I said, unless you're working on something that is specifically requiring the full extent of your concentration, of course, you take off the headphones. But I think they're a great help in softening the abuse that your brain will take when you're doing these really mind-numbing tasks. Again, just to sum up, pay attention to your body, how tired you may be when doing repetitive work. If you feel exhaustion coming on, ask yourself, when was the last time I took a decent holiday, meaning something at least a week long? Something away from a screen. A holiday isn't sitting on your sofa playing a computer game. You're in front of a screen at work anyway. So do try to get away from these machines and computers if you have to. Because, like I said, prevention is better than cure in this case. If you're familiar with the Disney book, The Illusion of Life, which was written by Frank Thomas and Ollie Johnston many years ago, you will have encountered the 12 principles of animation. And many of us use these as a great way to break down the core principles of animation. Let's zoom in a little bit on the list. So as you can see, we have the 12 principles, and at the bottom we have appeal. Now, this is where I disagree with the ordering, because the Disney attitude is that by putting appeal at the bottom, I think it implies that if you master steps 1 through 11, appeal will somehow emerge from these. This is how I interpret it, because appeal is a nebulous principle. So it's kind of frustrating when you're trying to get a drawing that's appealing. So I would put appeal at the top because I think it's separate to or even superior to the other 11 factors in this list. So again, we have the mentality on the one hand that if you get these 11 steps right, that hopefully appeal will come out of them, or it's a gloss that you apply on top of these 11. I think the opposite is true. I think that people who have work that has appeal don't necessarily have to worry about a lot of the stuff that mere mortals have to worry about. And I wish it was the other way around, because I'm a big fan of the 11 steps and I spent a long time getting good at them. So it's always frustrating when you get these more or less right and you don't have appeal. So let's take another look. We have all our 11 or 12 or whatever, tricks and techniques, however many you want. They don't add up to appeal. You can get them all right and still have work that has no appeal whatsoever, sad to say. So let me give you some examples that are fairly well known. The oatmeal, believe me, I mean no disrespect to any of these artists, but I think these guys will be the first to admit they don't follow these classic Disney traditional animation principles. They have work that is driven first and foremost by appeal and charm. And check out these websites if you want to see more examples of what I'm talking about. Hyperbole and a Half is another great one. These are incredibly appealing images, and there's no concern here for the traditional Disney or traditional animation rules and regulations. Another good example is stick figure theater. And this was, I think, done back in the 90s. It's from the old TV era. And if you search for them on YouTube and have a look, now these do have some of the principles. They do have timing and they do have some of the principles applied. But again, extremely simple, driven primarily by charm, by appeal. If the appeal was zero on these images, they wouldn't work at all. So the principle to take away from this is that you must make sure that your work has appeal. And it is mysterious, and I cannot tell you how. There's like some little guidelines, like button eyes tend to be appealing, little dots, eyes that are poking out in different directions. That's another common trick that people use. But you can do all that and still not have appeal. So there's no simple formula for it. And of course you can get appeal by doing the traditional Disney path, but it's lightning in a bottle. If you do have work with appeal, don't do anything to it that takes away that appeal. The worst thing that the Oatmeal or Hyperbole and a Half would do is watch my courses, because they have appeal. They don't need to. They're very successful. They have big audiences. It's not a worry for them. So again, I had a friend who had work that was tremendously appealing, and she fell in love with the Disney style, and it ruined her because she was trying to apply a style from Disney that didn't really fit with her work. And that's my warning to you. Not to not watch my movies. Watch my movies if you want to learn the classic style and techniques. But if you have some weird thing of your own that people love for some reason that nobody knows, I wouldn't really want to mess with it too much. If you're an experienced animator, your reaction to this movie will be, tell me something I don't know. If you're younger, if you're starting out, it's really important that you keep this in mind as your career goes forward. And it's about luck, fortune, and how things change. And this has been known for a very long time. And so we have in ancient and medieval philosophy the idea of the rota fortunae, the wheel of fortune. So here's a closer look at it, and you can see these poor people are strapped to the wheel. And here's the bad news. Those people strapped to that wheel are you and me. So we have many, many images of this wretched wheel, and we were just spun around by blind fate. And there she is. She's blindfolded in the bottom left-hand side. And there was an ancient Roman, I think, called Pacuvius, and he wrote about this. Philosophers say that fortune is insane and blind and stupid, that she does not see where she's heading. They say she's insane because she is cruel, flaky, and unstable. Stupid because she can't distinguish between the worthy and the unworthy. And you probably won't have to think very hard before you can think of a few people who had bad luck, who didn't deserve it, and the opposite. So this is simply the way reality is built, and there's nothing we can do about it except come up with some countermeasures or at least be ready for it. So again, we have more images, the king at the top, poor little peasant guy at the bottom. And this is the way our lives work, but you can think about them as a little more complex than this, because you have a personal wheel and a professional wheel and a financial wheel and an emotional wheel, a romantic wheel, so on. They're not all going to be necessarily at the top at the same time. Maybe sometimes they are. And you know, some people have everything goes wrong at the same time. Their house burns down, or gets robbed, I'm sick, my pet died, I lost my job. And that's when you have to be you're absolutely most careful that you don't make bad decisions to make this situation even worse. But this is how animation works. In animation, you'll be the king in July, and maybe by December, you're the poor guy at the bottom there. So the trick is, if you're at the top of the wheel, don't spend all your money is one good piece of advice. So you're putting some aside because you know at some point you're going to be at the bottom end of it. Yet another image, and here's the wheel at the very top. This time it's going around horizontally, but still, that's no fun. And again, they really love this wheel. And it's even on the tarot card. It's in one of the Trump tarot cards as the Wheel of Fortune. So how do you prepare yourself mentally for this? Remember a few keynotes, which is that there are no permanent jobs. Be ready to lose any job you'll ever have. And you might get lucky. There are a few jobs that do last for a good long stretch. I have friends who work on The Simpsons and Family Guy, and those are as close to lifer jobs as you're going to find in the industry. But sooner or later, those shows will end. Even The Simpsons, I know this is hard to believe, might end one day. And at that point, this rule will kick in. So when you do have a job, like I said earlier, don't go spending all your money at once. You need to be putting aside money for the downtime. So be prepared for change. And this isn't just the change of losing a job. I have on more than one occasion had my entire skill fall out from under me when the traditional 2D animation industry more or less disappeared in the late 90s, early 2000s. And we all were scrambling around to switch to CGI or Flash or other styles of animation. It's going to happen again. It doesn't seem to ever want to settle on one style or one tool. Even if you learn CGI, it's a runaway train. If you learn Maya, is it conceivable that one day Maya will be switched out for some other program? It could happen. So don't fall in love with one piece of software. This is kind of silly of me to say it because I went for about 15 years without keeping my resume and reel updated. So I'm a bit of a hypocrite, but I finally did it a few years ago. And make sure it's a nice one. If you do keep your reel updated, be sure you put all the really, really good scenes up at the start. I had a friend who put their reel up and all their best scenes were at the end. And I said, are you crazy? A lot of the people looking at these reels will watch the first 30 seconds. They might have 500 reels to watch. You've put your best scenes at the end. They could have switched it off by then and assumed that your best work was at the start. Your resume, of course, there's plenty of websites that'll teach you how to, the fine art of resume writing. I'm not going to cover it here. But you need a good, strong, clean resume. And LinkedIn is a great site for that. So be sure you use it. And you can save money when you earn money. If you can. I know not everybody can. If you can, take a good hard look at your expenses. And don't get lazy. By lazy, I mean, and again, a mistake I made. By the late 90s, early zeros, I thought I was the bee's knees. And I really stopped learning. And I was more or less happy with the plateau that I was on. And then I met a friend who I hadn't seen since the late 1980s or early 90s. And his work was terrible back then. And he had improved so much, he was like a different person. I felt really ashamed when I saw what he had done. So I thought, it's time for me to get my act together and to stop being so lazy or proud. And that's when I began going back and teaching myself, finding every book I could get my hand on. It was a tremendous decision. So never feel that your skill set's complete. That will be a big mistake, especially today. If you have free time, if you lose your job, if you have a leave of absence, use it. Unless you're exhausted and you absolutely need that time to physically and mentally recover. If you have free time and you have the energy for it, my strong recommendation is use that time on something productive. And by productive, I mean anything from a new skill, learn a new piece of software, or take the existing skills you know and upgrade them. But don't just settle for where you are. Another mistake I made, being a hermit, it doesn't work. So you need to be sure that you're more or less occasionally say hi to people. And it's easier these days than it used to be with Facebook and LinkedIn and all these other sites. So again, don't be a pest either, mind you. But it's nice that occasionally you remind people that you're still alive. And that way they keep you in mind if some work comes up and you have a freelance offer. I've had many freelance offers from simply people knowing that I'm still breathing. And this is kind of obvious, but be persistent. You just have to keep cracking. And if you stop being persistent, guess what? You won't succeed. A really easy thing that we should all know is be nice to people. And you'd be surprised, when you meet people who are professionally unpleasant. And I'm going to tell you the story of the chap on the left, who's based on a real person who spent the bulk of his career during the 80s and 90s being really, really abusive, emotionally abusive to all the people who were beneath him in the production hierarchy. And then something happened. The 2D animation industry basically collapsed and was replaced by CGI. And he was a traditional animator and he wasn't able to make the transition because he was too inflexible, whatever. So the amount of jobs that were still available, it wasn't zero, but it was beginning to shrink. All of the people that were formerly his little underlings here in blue, they got promoted and their careers went up. And now he can't get work. And it's like one of these morality tales that you would almost think is made up, but he literally cannot get work because all the people that he worked with remember him as being a basically terrible person. And it's too late for him now. He's basically ruined. So don't be this guy. And it's really simple. It's don't be a jerk. And now this is him slinking off. It's role reversal. So we work in a very volatile career where people who come in as interns 1 month can be running a studio a couple of years or a few years later. And indeed, I have a friend who's a lovely guy who, when I knew him back in the 80s, had, dreadlocks, and it was basically your classic counterculture type, and you would never have thought he would have amounted to anything. And now he runs his own studio. So the worst thing that you can do, especially if you're younger and you're starting out, is to make assumptions about who is going to succeed and who is going to fail. We should all know better by now, but this is just a little warning to be nice to people. So you don't have to be a suck-up, but you can be pretty pleasant and not be either a suck-up or a brute. So some career advice about the rough layout that you'll find the corporate hierarchy. So you have usually the boss or the owners at the top. You have middle management or management usually beneath them, the kind of executives, people who, if you want to call them bean counters, etc. And then you have various tiers of artists, senior artists, intermediate artists, and then various assistants or interns, people at the very bottom of this crude pyramid. Now, one mistake a person might make is to thinking that they should be super friendly to the boss or maybe the managers over and above everybody else. The danger with this is that more often than not, the people that will hire you 5 years down the line are down here or here or here. So the worst thing that you can do, as I've already said, is make that assumption. So the greatest advice you will ever have is not necessarily to be super friendly to everybody, but just get on with as many people as you can. It will vastly improve your chances, especially if jobs contract later on, if these people have fond memories of working with you. I have on occasion been rewarded by being on good terms with people from these tiers, but they're just fewer in number. There are far more people down here who will then get hired by other studios. Their bosses will say, "Do you know anybody good?" "Oh yeah, I know this guy, so-and-so," and maybe again in one of these levels, that'll be you. Hire him or her. They're great. So that is really strong advice, and you don't want to be basically left out in the cold. This movie might not be applicable to everybody. If you're working in a more technical field, you might think dreams, who cares? All I can tell you is it's been really important to me. So if you're working in any aspect of the field that involves creating the content or even working on like large scale projects, I think you might find this interesting. So I keep pretty close tabs on my dreams. I find some of them are incomprehensible, and some of them are actually quite comprehensible when you know how to deal with them. So before I go any further, I just want to highlight 2 resources. This page by John Betts, he's a Jungian psychoanalyst, and it's a really nice page with an outline on dreams and some of the tricks that you can use to interpret dreams. So do check that out. It's pretty concise. And there's also this book, if you're really interested in how dreams have influenced people in creative fields, including composers, musicians, as well as other artists and writers. This is a really interesting book, so you might find this enjoyable. So one thing to bear in mind about interpreting a dream and how it might be appropriate to you is the difference between a sign and a symbol. And a symbol points to something else that maybe isn't itself, but a sign like a stop sign usually means stop. It's usually like a sign that means the same thing to everybody, but a symbol can be a little more plastic. So a person who maybe has lost somebody to the sea might have a dream of the ocean that means something different to a surfer. But sometimes these images can have strong meanings to a greater number of people. So I've had a recurring dream about powerful oceans. Even though they're on one level frightening, I really enjoy them because the ocean is this translucent blue-green, and I always feel weirdly refreshed by it. Tolkien is a famous example of a person who had a recurring dream about riding a tidal wave towards a beautiful green land. He called it his Atlantean dream. And the really spooky thing is he never told anybody about it, and then his son told him that he was having this dream. So father and son had the same powerful recurring Atlantean dream. Make of that what you will. But I'll tell you about the dream that really turned my career around. And I really mean this. I was a different person before I figured out this recurring dream. In this dream, I would be in my childhood home or a building that I used to live in. And I would see a door, a little small hidden door on the side of the wall. So I would open the door, and there's usually cobwebs or rubble, bits of debris. And I would clean this away, overcoming my fear of spiders, and crawl down into this hidden room. And lo and behold, as I move around this hidden room, it gets bigger. And it's got animation desks and pool tables and Space Invader games and ping pong tables and other rooms off the main room. In the most extreme version of this dream, the last time I had it, there was an underground mountain and lake. And at this point, it was getting ridiculous, and I had to figure out what it meant. So I finally dug up a book that was a dream dictionary. Now, dream dictionaries can be problematic because, again, some things can mean different things to different people. If a dream dictionary says a dog is a symbol for loyalty, well, it's not a symbol to loyalty if, as a child, you were bitten by a dog and seriously injured. So you have to factor in that certain things mean different things to different people. But in general, this book said that when you dream about rooms or buildings, it's a symbol pointing towards your mind, and the different parts of the house represent parts of your psyche. And now, when I read that, then the dream was obvious. The dream was telling me that my little tiny house above ground was dwarfed by the subterranean and forgotten and neglected underground room system. And that's when I realized, bingo, my mind was telling me you're only using a fraction of your true potential. Within 6 months of interpreting that dream, I had animated 7 minutes of my film. That was on top of updating a blog, doing a weekly comic strip, and holding down my day job. So you get the idea. So about fast forward 5 years, and this movie that I began working on was now half an hour long, and I hadn't quite finished it yet. So my subconscious has a wicked sense of humor. So this dream emerged. And in this dream, I was friends or a colleague of Orson Welles or some other famous actor. And I realized in the dream that I had worked with Orson Welles as a child. And I would run around telling all of my friends, hey, do you know that I used to work with Orson Welles and how talented I used to be? And they would be all amazed and I would be so proud. And then I would remember, wait a minute, I've never worked with Orson Welles. What was I thinking? And this moment of horrible realization that I've told people this ridiculous story, and now I'm going to have to go around and tell them all that I never was friends with Orson Welles. It was just something I made up. And then I realized this dream was my mind punishing me for procrastinating. I wasn't finishing my movie. I'd been sitting on this thing for ages. I'd been working on it for 5 years. And all it needed was another push, maybe another month or two of work, and it was finished. And so I finished the project, and that dream never came back. So you see the importance of dealing with these dreams. They can both unlock your hidden creative talents. They can also punish you when you're not finishing them. So the recurring dreams are the ones to watch out for in particular. If it's coming back at you again and again and again, it's because your subconscious mind is telling you something really important, that you are either failing on some level or there's some opportunity that you're missing out on, and it's screaming at you, and it's doing it in symbols. So watch out for the dreams, watch out for the symbols, and do check out that John Betts website, and do also check out that book if you want to pursue this in a deeper manner. One problem a lot of people have is animating a really nice, rich secondary action. So if a character has like long flowing garments or a big tail or long hair, how do you animate that so it looks nice and fluid and it doesn't stick or jam? So in this case, we have a figure going into a nice little squash and a jump. So if we look at the full sequence of animation with all the breakdowns added, we have our little breakdown scenes here. So it's a fairly intricate action, and you can see the timing numbers at the bottom. So how do you go about adding, say, a squirrel tail to this action? So we could take a top-down approach and, plan it at the thumbnail level and figuring out where the tail should go. And this is definitely one way to do it. The problem with doing it like this is you really have to know your timing and the spacing so that the tail doesn't stick anywhere. It'll suit a certain temperament, and this is a great option. This is a great way of doing it. But let me show you an alternative. So here we have the figure, and I've given him a squirrel head, so he looks more appropriate to that big tail. And all I did here was I roughed in very lightly, very crudely, a first outline of the tail on frame 1. And all I did was I animated the tail straight ahead. I moved forward 4 frames. So every 4 frames, there's another tail. So the first is on frame 1, the next is on frame 5, at 4, the next is on frame 9. There's nothing stopping you from doing this on 5s or 6s or 3s. If it's a faster action, there's nothing stopping you from changing the timing a little bit. But this is a very, very basic method to see if it worked. So let's take a look at this. Now, there's a little bit of offset because, as you can see, the tail's on 4s, but the figure is on 1s. So the figure's on 24 frames per second, and the tail is only every 4 frames, or about 6 frames a second. So it's not quite lining up. But even here, you can see that this is getting a nice, fluid, flippy action. So let's add in the breakdowns and see if this works. So on this version, I added in just one drawing between the keyframes on the previous pass. So how you do this is you put down your first frame and you move forward 4 and you just draw in the next tail in the sequence. And more often than not, it's simply pointing back towards the direction from which it's coming. And very occasionally, as the major actions happen, as the figure moves down, you will see the tail move in the opposite direction. So here I'm going to play the scene in slow motion. You know where to put the nice reversal. Here we have the C shape, still a C shape. And there we have a nice reversal on the landing. And that's all it takes. So this is not the kind of thing, if you've never done it before, you may get it right first time as I did here. It might take you several passes. It's certainly a different way of planning out this kind of action. But because I was able to do this on a completely clean layer, separate from the rest of the character, it really freed me up. So let me speed him back up again, and let's look at a slightly more finished version. I think we can speed him up a bit more too. It's looking pretty good. So when I finish the line work, this is the result. So this is an example, again, like I said, of using straight ahead animation on a separate layer from a fully animated figure who we've done with pose to pose. It may not be applicable to everything that you do. Again, I know some of you are working with rig systems and CGI, but certainly if you can apply this, it's certainly worth trying out, especially if you've been having problems with like clothing, with hair, long tails, or any kind of secondary action that just doesn't feel right to you. Do give this a go. One scene that might frighten you, especially if you're maybe newer to animation, or even if you're working in a system that's like rig-based, something in Flash, Harmony, or even a CGI system, maybe you get a scene where a figure has to go from one pose into a very different pose. As we have here, maybe you're given a scene where you have this A, B, C, and D sequence of keys, and you might wonder, how on earth am I going to Frankenstein this character from one of these into the other in a way that's believable? So let me show you one trick that might, at least in some instances, help. First of all, let's show you the finished scene. So in this scene, there's an earthquake and the character's bouncing around his chair and he ends up flat on the floor. So it's snappy, certainly. It's definitely snappy, but I think the transition from one of these into the other is fairly acceptable. So let's look at how this was done. So this is the start position when he's sitting in the chair, and then I worked him using the same rig or the same basic pose. Now this could apply to a hand-drawn scene, a Flash scene, or a Flash animate scene, a Harmony scene, or even a rig system in a 3D program, but that might be a little more strange if we see it in CGI. But this certainly works in the 2D end of the animation spectrum. So we move him into this position and then snap. I snapped him into this with nothing in between those two, and then we ease into that. So that's it. We have 1, 2, snap into this, 4. So there's only 4 frames to achieve that effect. So these were the frame numbers that the transitions happened on. So for the first frame 1 through 5, he's more or less in this position. And then I slide him into number 9. And then he's in 10 and he eases into number 14. And the same trick is used throughout. So there's nothing between the transitions. So look at that huge jump from the blue pose to the red one. you would think that you would need an intermediate drawing there. But because in this case the spacing is so wide and we're easing out of one into the other, we're able to cheat that transition from one rig pose into another one with nothing in between the two. So we have our lying flat, and that's the same thing, just torqued or twisted into this position and then snap. Now notice something as well, that the head is moving smoothly. 1, 2, 3, 4. It's not doing anything weird. It's not zigzagging. So it's a very simple movement from this position into this one. And if we look at the feet are not doing anything super heroic either. They're moving from here to there to here to there. So they're more or less following a same physical path. So we have a smooth arc here. We have a smooth arc there. So nothing is doing anything extremely weird. And the same applies to this transition. 1, 2, 3, 4. So there's no head pops. It's a very fast movement from this into that. And we can apply the same to the feet. The feet begin here. They move to here. They do snap to this side. So they do a big zig. But it's so huge, I don't think the eye can really even detect it. So let's look at the final scene again. So now that you've seen the frame by frame, you're in a better position to judge to see if you think those transitions and cheats work or not. And I think they do. I'm not seeing like any ghastly pops there. It certainly wouldn't hurt were you to add like a hand drawn in between that was, smoothing it out just a little for that like one extra frame between them. But he's moving so fast, it's really not needed. Now, were this a slow scene, you certainly would need those. But this trick is going to work for a lot of scenes, especially fast ones, scenes with fast transitions from one of these rigs to another. This is a pretty simple movie. It's just to show you model sheets in case, you may be one of the newer recruits into the industry who maybe has never seen one of these. Because often if you're working on a production now, you'll be given a 3D rig or a Flash Animate rig or a Harmony rig or some such. But it's a really good idea if a production can have a traditional equivalent to a model sheet, if not one of these. So the model sheets were created in the traditional period to show the animators how to draw the characters fairly consistently. Now, you wouldn't want to be slavishly copying the model sheets, but they're there to make sure that your basic proportions and constructions are correct. And the best ones will have turnarounds. So in this case, you've got the A, B, C, D, and E angles, or front on, 3/4 profile, and so on. Often you'll see the characters measured out in head heights. So in this case, because of his unusual head top, I've actually offset these slightly, so you have little half heads to show that the general height of the tuft of hair. We measured the bodies in skulls. So as you can see, we have the skull height gives you like about a 3 to 4 head tall character. Well, he's a 4 heads tall if you count the hair, 3.5 without. So we have construction markers to show the points of the neck. Now, I was fairly loose with this guy, but oftentimes people will be a bit more precise with these sheets about, where the different parts go. But I thought this was all right. You know that the wrists in this neutral position will be 1.5 heads tall off the ground. The chin is roughly 2.5 heads high and so forth. So on a really nicely set up production, you'll have head sheets as well. And these will show you not just the head in turnarounds, but also different mouth shape designs. And if the designers have been very kind, you'll get problem angles solved. So huge problem angles are these kind of up shots and down shots and rear shots and extreme mouth positions. So this means that the artists have the design problem solved for them. So if they ever have to draw these weird shapes, they won't be all inventing their own variant. Now, in the modern period, if you work with a rig system, oftentimes you'll get the rig with these mouth shapes already set up in them. But that's the equivalent. In CGI, you'll have a blend shape, or in Flash or Harmony, a keyframe with all of these hopefully created for you. Another thing that I think is less common today, certainly in Flash or Harmony productions, is to have problem poses already worked out, or a big library of strong poses for the character. And we would get these a lot on features in the past, where usually the best animators who worked on the first few scenes would have some really strong drawings. They would be Xeroxed and then pasted up onto a series of sheets where they would inspire the other artists to follow that level or that style. And these would also help to tie down the personality of the characters as well. So these are nice if you have time, if the production allows. This is really recommended. And I think it's been forgotten. I think in some productions I've worked on anyway, I know this has been kind of left out. And we have, again, basic construction and proportions of characters, which we saw earlier in the Space Fox character. He was like the figure on the right. But there's nothing stopping a redesign. You know, if someone comes in and thinks, I think he should be a little older, we'll give him an extra half of a head. So, but again, it's important that once this is locked down, that you follow along. If you are working on a traditional production, that you figure this out at the beginning, don't change it later on. So this is a character that I designed for my storyboard course, Bumstead, and he's the hero of the film Bumstead versus the Martians. So again, we have the height system, and again, some model sheets will show you really strong guides as to how to construct the various proportions of the character. And you can have guides that'll tell you the corner of the tie should be at this height, depending on how picky they are. So I was fairly loose with this one. And again, we have a robot turnaround. So there's any number of characters that you might have on a given production. This is the Evil Martian, which then raises the problem of size comparison. So oftentimes you'll have size comparison sheets that will simply show you the robot is 4 times the height of Bumstead. So again, you struggle to keep your size comparisons in line. It's very easy to let them slide. So it's one of the things to watch out for. And you might have a production with a range of characters. And again, you'll get these very cool, if you've ever seen one of the originals from a hand-drawn production, you get these really, really long landscape printouts that have all of the characters on them in relative size. So there's no excuse for the animators to get the scales or the proportions wrong. It can really look strange when you do one scene with the characters given one size comparison. And if the animator gets it wrong, it can look really bizarre. And a scene could have to be completely reanimated if you make a mistake. So that's it. That's the traditional model sheet and the head sheets and pose reference and size comparisons. Let's take a look at a moving hold. So this is a scene first that doesn't have one. And in this scene, we have our figure coming to a full stop and everything, arms, head, body, legs, all stop on the same frame. So there's no moving hold here. It all feels very mechanical. Boink. Right into there like a machine. So this was my original thumbnail for this scene where we, obviously it's a much longer scene. All I've done is focused on these few frames here as he's moving into the stop. Very common thing to have to do. And again, we're just zooming in a bit. So the scene that you just saw, I think, is about these last 3 or 4 images. So let's overlay my thumbnail. So I was going to do a scene something like this. So we begin in a contact pose. We work into the second contact pose half a second later. And then our final pose again half a second later because we're on 24 frames a second here. And that's it. So how do we get him into this position? So we have our number 7 is a passing position, slightly down. And then we have our real down positions on 4 and 17. And we have an up positions on 10 and 21. And that's pretty much it. And if I run through these one by one, that's the scene. That's what's got us to where we are. So this figure doesn't have any clothing or hair. He's a little doughboy. So there's not that much potential right now for a super impressive moving hold, but let's do what we can with what we've got. So what I decided to do with this for the first pass was to slow down the left hand, or hand that's furthest away from us. You see how it's coming to a stop a little slower? I'm going to play this at half speed. Let's play him again. So now watch, that hand takes now 2 or 3 frames longer to come to a rest. So that's our moving hold. That's the simplest possible version that you could come up with, is simply delay one body part so that it doesn't all hit that last stop position at the same time. So let's see if we can push this a little further. So on this pass, I added a little drag on the hand closest to us, his physical right hand. And as you can see, I just flared the fingers a little bit. So now the fingers come in at a slightly different time. Maybe we can push this a little further. So now I'm moving that hand a little more boldly. And as you can see now, the far hand comes to a stop 2 frames after the body. The close hand comes to a stop, I think about 4 or 5 frames later. So now we have the two versions. On the top row, we have the mechanical stop, which has no moving hold. And on the bottom, we have the moving holds added to the far hand and the near hand. Now, I think the near hand is moving a little too violently, and that little up right there is just a little too much. It's overkill. So, but it's the kind of thing that you struggle with. And I think in general, it's better to overdo it and then pull it back in. So in the next movie, I'm going to show you how to take this existing pass and how to build on it and make it even stronger. In the previous movie, we saw how to take a simple animation doughboy and give him a basic moving hold. There's a limit to what you can do with a really simple character if the rig or puppet or design doesn't have something that can drag. But if he does have, or she has, clothing that can drag or long hair, there's a lot more that we can do and really make this look more interesting. So in this case, I've given him nice flared pants. So on this pass, the pants are not adding to the moving hold. They're simply moving with the feet, like they're starched. So we have the moving hold elements of the hands definitely still there though. So now on another pass, we're going to drag the pants, the trousers. So as you can see at the base of the trousers, you can see that they've overshot and fallen back. So this took a bit of fidgeting. I won't go into the nuts and bolts of how I went into each of these frames because your characters are going to look quite different from this. But you get the basic idea. As the leg moves forward, the pants drag. I will play this at half speed so you have a better chance of seeing what's going on. And let me slow it down a little more. And then that's really nice. Now it's coming to the stop, I think very close to the same frame as the hand that's closest to us. So that's a shame because it's nice if they would come to a stop on different frames. It would just give that nicer sense of overlap. So let's do another pass of this thing. And I've also added the drag on the far leg as well now. Not too much because we're barely seeing it. And the first pass that I made on this, it was distracting. So I just reined it in to be as subtle as possible. Let's go to half speed. And I think the trousers may be coming to a stop, still too close to the hand, but it would be very easy to offset this by a little more. In an ideal scene, you would have the left hand, the left foot, and the right foot, each coming to a stop on a different frame or close enough to it. So frame 23, then 24, then 25, not too far apart, within a reasonable spectrum of numbers. If there's a lot of drag on the trousers, they might take like a little, if they're very light material, then you might see them swing back and forth. If they're made out of jeans, they'll come to a stop much quicker. So do remember the material attributes as well. Now on this pass, I gave them a long coat so you can really see the principle. And it's just following along. I think I drew in the coat like every fourth or fifth frame. So it was just dragging behind very smoothly. And I'm going to go to, again, a much slower speed. And as you can see now, the coat comes to a full stop about 3 or 4 frames after the hand and the foot. So again, it gives a much nicer overlapping action than we saw on the previous version. Now we have all these different elements that are all independent and they all have their own physical properties. And the more of these objects you have in a character, if the character had a hair, a scarf, other, components to the design, in an ideal scene, they would all arrive just slightly separate from one another. That would be golden. So, of course, each one of these components that you add creates more time, adds more complexity to the scene, but they do make it look really nice. And they stop that abrupt feeling that you have when it comes to a full stop. So here he is in full speed again. So that's a really nice piece of motion, and it's starting to show you the kind of tricks that animators use, especially during the golden age. All the traditional animators from the early period would use tricks like these so that they could move a character into a held pose without it feeling artificial and jagged.